Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. I started to subtitle my title slide today that I think, in a way that I think studying the Red Book of Houston demonstrates. I started to add the subtitle, The Power of History to Explain and Shape the World Around Us. The longer title of the source that Kathleen mentioned, The Red Book of Houston, a compendium of social, professional, religious, educational, and industrial interest of Houston's colored population, 1915, gives you some sense of the breadth of information Black Houstonians collected in this volume and what it can tell us about the city in 1915. But first I have to give you an origin story, not for the volume, but for the digital project. The project started with Nori Guthrie, shown here, doing what she does best, which is sharing her enthusiasm for sources with a larger public. She is an archivist and special collections librarian at Fondren, and she found this source, read it from cover to cover, and noticed the many addresses for schools, businesses, churches, and private residents included. She immediately thought it contained a wealth of information that could be mapped. Nori also conceived of this mapping project as one that would include students. She reached out to me to see if I might serve as a mentor to these students, and I jumped at the chance, though technically I am a 19th century historian, and things in the 20th century feel very modern to me, but I too was astonished by how much information the Red Book contained. So let's talk about this richness. The Red Book was published in 1915, though it's not entirely clear by whom, and was meant to commemorate the 50 years since the end of the Civil War and emancipation. The early pages of the Red Book frequently reference the progress made by the African American population in those 5 decades. Black Houstonians were pointing to history themselves, I would argue, to make a claim about the rights and respect they deserved in the present, right? So already we have in the source an argument for the power and value of history to talk about people's experiences in the present. Emmett J Scott, pictured here, who had been born and raised in Houston, served as the secretary to Booker T. Washington at the Tuskegee Institute, and also was appointed by President Taft to serve as a commissioner to the Republic of Liberia, wrote effusively in the opening pages of the Red Book that a careful analysis of the progress of those of the race who are surrounded by suitable conditions and have proper encouragement shows that since the Civil War, it has surpassed that of any known race that has come up out of slavery. Scott then enumerated the number of Black schools. Here you can see an image from the Red Book of a school with students and faculty in front of it, created since the end of the war. He noted that we went from 0 institutions in the South for higher and secondary education for Negro students to 50. From 111,000 students in 1867 to over 1.7 million by 1915, from 699 colored teachers in 1867 to 34,000. The amount of money invested in Black education, he noted, had grown from a few $1,000s to almost 15 million. The growth of national organizations created by African Americans was also noted, from 0 to 10. He also described the changing occupations freed people now held, from practically only agricultural workers under slavery to more than 50,000 in professions of teachers, preachers, lawyers, doctors, dentists, editors, etc., and another 40,000 in business for themselves. And here is a page from the Red Book where you can see some of the businesses that people were engaged in. Scott proclaimed a record of Black achievement, and then the pages of the Red Book that followed offered evidence of individual examples of that success. Sometimes this evidence came in the form of short biographies about Black Houstonians. So Reverend N.P. Pullum here, pictured with his second wife, Emma Chandler, was born in Pickingsville, Louisiana in 1862. He attended schools in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. He pastored churches in Louisiana and came to Texas in 1895. While Pullum pastored at Friendship Baptist Church, the congregation was able to purchase a lot valued at $5,000 and begin the erection of a $20,000 edifice. He was also the owner of Pullum Brickyards and accumulated lots and property worth nearly $40,000. Here you can see a picture of his home at the time, also from the Red Book, and then his home in the present, and you can also see where it's located in 4th Ward on the map, right? So I'll provide a link later, but you can go into the Red Book website yourself and you can look at some of these images and look at where some of these businesses and homes, schools, churches were located on the map. From this one entry, we can gather a lot of information about migration patterns, about the pursuit of education, the practice of religious life, and business engagement. This entry in the Red Book also includes the Pullum's home address, so we can use this information to map not just Black Houston in 1915, but paired with other research, population movement internal to the city as well. The first group of students who worked on this project, pictured here, largely focused on extracting location data from the entries in the Red Book and then compiling them into a spreadsheet. They also worked with Norrie Guthrie to map as many of the addresses mentioned as possible using GIS and historical maps. This was work funded by Fondren Library and by the History Department. In other instances, the Red Book provides a starting point for inquiry. So that information I gave you just now is information that's included in the Red Book. But in other moments, it gives you, again, a starting point. So here is, I find, the quite grand home of B.J. Covington. And it's located in 3rd Ward, as you can see, and you can see the image in the past, and in the present, it's an empty lot. If we do a little digging elsewhere outside of the Red Book, we can find the short biography of Benjamin Jesse Covington, MD, written here by Mrs. Willie Lee Gay on September 16th, 1993. Mrs. Gay wrote that that Covington's life began in the 6th year of freedom on a farm near Marlin, Texas. There's something really powerful and poetic, it seems to me, to use that language, in the 6th year of freedom. It actually makes me a little teary to think of how people are marking emancipation that time as the start of something, right? And that's an important moment. So after he's born by the age of 8, he is operating farm equipment drawn by oxen, horses, and/or mules. After being educated and working as a teacher in Marlin, he will move to Houston in 1894. A year later, he was a student at Meharry Medical School in Tennessee. And by the time of his graduation in 1900, he was, according to Mrs. Gay, one of 20 Black physicians in the state. Within 2 years, he would meet and marry Jenny Bell Murphy, and later they would have a daughter, Ernestine Jesse, a pianist, who ended up attending Oberlin College. Currently, we have a student, pictured here, who is doing this kind of work for the project. She's funded by the History Department, and she's taking individual pictures that she finds in the Red Book and doing research so that she can write these biographies of these individuals that then can be added to the website. So we think that this kind of work for the students is an opportunity for them to learn about the city in which they're living at the moment, but it's also an opportunity for them to hone their own skills in terms of research and writing. But of course, there's a public component to this project as well. So here you can see the online exhibit. We want this work to be a resource for a wider audience. Thus, people may access both the digital copy of the Red Book, so you can go to the Fondren's website and see the pages of the digital copy, but you can also look at this information that Norrie and the students have extracted from the book in the website. While information about African American life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries can be hard to come by, the Red Book provides a wealth of information about how Black Houstonians lived. We hope that many different types of users will take advantage of this data. Scholars interested in both the large trends and small details of African American life, for instance. We hosted a panel that included scholars from the area who talked about Black life in Houston in various wards. We hope that individuals who want to research families, their own family histories, can take advantage of the Red Book. And this is just a screenshot of an article written by Joy Sewing for the Houston Chronicle Online. And part of what we wanted to get out there into the public is that you too, if you have a history here in the city of Houston, you can go into the Red Book and see if you can find out more information about your family. We also hope that community groups might be interested in using the resources provided by the Red Book and by the database. In that, Nori Guthrie and the students and I, for instance, met with some community members who wanted to use the information from the website to create an app so that they could have a tour. So people who come to Houston could use their phones and follow a freedom tour or an emancipation trail in the city and see various important locations, right? So we hope that various users will take advantage of the existence of the website and of this information. So to return to our Scientia theme, the power of the Red Book and the history it contains is that it helps us understand how African Americans built their lives and communities in Houston in the decades after the Civil War, which in turn explains the present landscape of the city, a topic to which my colleague Caleb McDaniel will elaborate in a few moments. And the history of Houston, in part, connects this history in Houston of the Black population in Houston, in part, connects to the present location of Rice University. I don't want to scoop anything that Caleb is going to tell you. And the last thing that I want to say about the power of the Red Book is to reiterate its importance, in my view, in two important ways. Again, it tells us how Black Houstonians imagined and did change the world that they were living in the early 20th century, right? They were pursuing education. They were pursuing economic opportunities. And they saw this as a powerful way for them to publicize that, to demonstrate the value that they were contributing here in the city of Houston, but also to demand the rights that they deserved here in the city of Houston, right? So I think it's performing that work, but it's also helping us in the present moment understand why the city is segregated in the ways that it is, why certain populations live in certain areas, and I hope, helps us to think about how we want to change what the landscape of the city of Houston looks like and how we might achieve that. Thank you.
What does it mean to be a university whose foundations were deeply structured by racism and racial exclusion? How is a university shaped by its beginnings as a segregated institution? And can studying our origins help us to create a better future? These are some of the questions that motivate the work of the Rice University Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice, which was commissioned by President David Lebron in 2019. Last year, as you may know, the task force released an update on our research about slavery, but since then, we have been hard at work expanding our research to the history of the university itself. And today, I'm going to be sharing with you just one piece of this ongoing research. It intersects with what you've just heard about the Red Book of Houston, and it relates to a seemingly simple but actually complex question. When did Rice University's history with segregation begin? Let me start by showing you a map from the Woodson Research Center and Fondren Library that was made in 1923, 11 years after the formal opening of the William Marsh Rice Institute, now Rice University, in 1912. On this map, you can see a large shape clearly labeled the William M. Rice Institute property. It's bordered on the right by Louisiana Street. But if you look just beneath it to your left, you will find a smaller rectangle labeled with two words. using a racial descriptor that was common 100 years ago, the caption appears to mark this lot as a Black Houstonian's property. Now, if you're like I was when I first saw it, then this map is raising a number of questions for you. First and foremost, why was this lot labeled that way? But also, what in the world is the Rice Institute doing on Louisiana Street? Isn't Rice located on South Main? Well, let me start with that question because it's the easiest to answer. Although it's no longer widely known, the first trustees of the Rice Institute did not originally intend to build their campus here on Main Street where we're currently sitting. They initially planned to build a campus on a much smaller tract of land located in the 4th Ward. And that's what this map from 1923 is depicting, a part of the tract that, in another world, could have been the Rice Institute campus. Here I've outlined in red the location and full extent of this original tract on a Google map today. And because it sits right at the intersection of Leland and Louisiana Street, I'm going to refer to it throughout this talk as the Louisiana Street property. Today, as you can see, the Louisiana Street property sits squarely in Houston's downtown. It's less than a mile south of City Hall, and it's the current home of Chevron. Some of you may even remember it as the former headquarters of Enron. Or you may even have seen it on TV last week when the parade honoring the World Series champion Houston Astros passed right through it on Smith Street. About 150 years ago, however, this property belonged to William Marsh Rice. He first acquired these 6 or 7 acres, sometimes known as the Swain Tract, in 1877. 14 years later, in 1891, Rice and the first trustees signed a charter to establish the William Marsh Rice Institute, infamously restricting it to the white inhabitants of Houston and Texas. And the next year, in 1892, Rice transferred this tract to his institute and designated it as the future campus. Now, back then, the Louisiana Street property was not the center of downtown as it is today. It was still on the outer edge of the central business district, but it was also on the edge of a vibrant community in the 4th Ward. And here's where this story begins to intersect with the research that we just heard about. Because if we look at the map of places mentioned in the Red Book, we can see the Louisiana Street property was right on the edge of a neighborhood that was densely populated with Black businesses, homes, and churches. In the years immediately after the Civil War, this part of the 4th Ward had become known as Freedmanstown because this was one of the first parts of the city where freed people settled and built new institutions in the wake of slavery. In fact, today, the Freedmanstown District is one of a few sites in Houston designated as a UNESCO Site of Memory on the International Roots of Slavery project, best known for the streets that early African-American residents paved themselves with bricks. Here's a picture I took from one of these blocks. And in the background, you can see the Chevron or old Enron building marking the location of the Louisiana Street property. Before I-45 was built through the 4th Ward, it would have been within walking distance of Freedmanstown. All of this means that when William Marsh Rice acquired this property in 1877, it was bordered on the west by this historically significant Black community. And it was also even closer to 2 other historically significant African-American institutions. A few blocks to the north was Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, the congregation led by Jack Yates, a formerly enslaved minister who's the namesake of Yates High School in the 3rd Ward. The church, first erected in 1875, still stands on the same site today. You can see the Enron building there in the background. Meanwhile, on the southern border of the Louisiana Street property stood the original building for the Gregory Institute, which was Houston's first school to teach multiple grades of African-American children. Today, you can visit the African-American library at the Gregory School at its current location, which is some blocks to the west, but the original Gregory Institute, a 2-story brick building, was built right here by the Freedmen's Bureau in 1869. And the land for the school was purchased with funds raised by Richard Allen, a deacon at Antioch, and other black leaders during Reconstruction. Now, by 1891, students at the Gregory Institute had moved to the nearby colored high school, later known as Booker T. Washington. And not long after, the original Gregory building was torn down when the city of Houston extended Jefferson Street. So you can see Jefferson Street here coming through where the Gregory Institute was. But for its first quarter century, the historic Gregory Institute stood here. And not surprisingly, given all the churches and school buildings and businesses surrounding it, there were also dozens of black homeowners who owned or lived in this vicinity. One of them that you can see right here, this pink dot right here, was a school teacher named Dally Miller, and I want you to remember her name later, but also remember that these dots are depicting only the homes of people who appeared in the Red Book of Houston, so it's not a complete picture of all of the black homeowners in this area. In fact, if we zoom in a little bit closer on this tract, we can see that in 1872, a white developer named W.J. Fredericks bought this tract and divided it into 9 lots, all fronted by a narrow pathway here that became known as Smith Alley. And before long, all of those lots were purchased by black homeowners. Lot 3, for example, was purchased by Henry C. Hardy, the first black principal of the Gregory Institute. Hardy lived there with his wife, Laura, who remained there after they divorced, and it's her sister, Dally Miller, who was the school teacher whose dot we just noticed on the Red Book map in 1915. But most of these lots were purchased in the early 1870s, which meant that their owners were often people who had only recently been freed from slavery, in the 5th or 6th year of freedom, as Dr. Yarbrough put it. In 1873, for example, Sally Wicks, a black woman around 45 years old, purchased Lot 5 and moved there with her teenage daughter, Betty, who was likely born enslaved. And in 1891, the same year the Rice Institute was chartered, she would bequeath it to her daughter, now named Betty Leonard. Across the alley from them lived one of the earliest black property owners in this area, Robert Shaw. He was born in 1840 in Virginia and was likely a survivor of slavery there and in Texas. But in 1871, Shaw paid $200 for 10,000 square feet. And a bird's eye map of Houston from 1873 may even depict Robert Shaw's home encircled by trees right here. And in the background, you can see just a few steps away the 2-story brick building that likely depicts the Gregory Institute. Now, at that time, Shaw was one of the few living in this area, but before long, all of the lots in the Fredericks edition were occupied. And with more time, I could tell you more about all of these names. But let's pause here for just a moment and reflect on what all of this means. It means that the first site to be considered by William Marsh Rice and the Rice Trustees for their whites-only institute was right in the middle of a thriving African-American community that was built in the immediate aftermath of slavery. And the earliest officials of the Rice Institute, including William Marsh Rice himself, could not have been unaware of these many black neighbors. In fact, some of them, we know, were known to Rice officials by name. For example, you remember Betty Leonard and Laura Hardy, the residents of Lot 5 and Lot 3. Well, both of them were listed in the census as nurses. And in one of those strange historical coincidences that it's impossible to make up, Betty Leonard and Laura Hardy actually served for a week as sick nurses to William Marsh Rice's invalid wife while the couple was visiting Houston from New York shortly before she died in 1896. The Rice Institute's first business manager, A.B. Cohn, would also later testify in a legal document that he was, quote, well acquainted with the Negro woman Betty Leonard from having, quote, numerous talks with her about trying to buy her property for Rice. In 1899, Emmanuel Rafael, one of the first Rice trustees, was also asked in a deposition about the Rice Institute's property here, and the questioning drew out his thoughts on the area's racial composition. What is the value of the Louisiana Street property in Houston, Texas, that Mr. Rice conveyed to the Institute, asked the lawyer. And Rafael answered, "I suppose that would be worth around $15,000 or $20,000. What sort of a neighborhood is there around it?" "Not very good." "Isn't it most all colored population?" "On two sides it is colored, but one side is white people." Rafael's description of the by then predominantly black neighborhood as not very good may hint at the worry of an early board member about the Fourth Ward as a site for the institute that they were planning. Over the next 3 decades, white real estate professionals across the country would develop racially discriminatory standards for rating the value of urban property like this. And in most cities, they operated on the assumption that black ownership would depress the value of property in a neighborhood, an assumption that then often became a self-fulfilling prophecy. These judgments laid the groundwork in many ways for patterns of residential segregation and economic inequality that we still see in diverse cities like Houston today. But to get back to the story of the Louisiana Street property, in 1900, as you probably know, William Marsh Rice was famously murdered in New York City. The butler did it. And after several years of litigation, the Institute came into the possession of the bulk of Rice's huge estate. The trustees now had a lot more money to work with, and they started to explore other possible sites for their campus. In the meantime, though, the trustees were still actively considering the Louisiana Street property as a candidate for their campus as they searched for a president, provided that they could make it larger. And that meant trying to buy out the black property owners around the grounds. So beginning in 1905, the trustees engaged a third party to start buying up surrounding lots. Their typical practice was to conceal from the property owners that the Institute was the actual interested buyer. And they kept the sales from the public record at first in order to keep the prices low. Thus, by 1908, the Institute had succeeded in acquiring almost all of the properties in the Fredericks edition, as you can see in this map, the William Marsh Rice Institute here and here and here from 1916. But there were a few black property owners who refused to sell. And you can see them listed here too: Betty Leonard, Laura Hardy, Robert Shaw. And you can remember that Rice business manager A.B. Cohn recalled visiting Leonard repeatedly to try to get her to sell. And when persuasion didn't work, the Institute tried something else. They began to fence in all the property they did own, surrounding the holdouts with barriers. One fence in particular, on this line, had the effect of literally blocking off the alley where Leonard, Hardy, and Shaw lived, leaving the remaining black residents with no pathway to the street from their own homes. But if the Institute hoped that this would convince Leonard, Hardy, and Shaw to sell, they badly miscalculated. Because in 1909, these 3 black neighbors instead boldly filed a lawsuit against the William Marsh Rice Institute in district court, seeking an injunction to stop Rice from blocking off the alley. It's not clear whether they were successful in 1909, but in 1912, we know the Institute apparently did have a fence here because the plaintiffs filed a new pleading with the court, again asserting their right to access their homes. Now, I know I've been throwing a lot of detail at you, but let's pause and just think for a moment about what it signified that these 3 black landowners were challenging the William Marsh Rice Institute in a court of law. Consider first what they were up against. Remember, all of this was unfolding in a Jim Crow city, in the Jim Crow South. By this time, black Texans were no longer able even to cast votes in elections. Lynchings and racial violence were common across the South. Racial segregation had been codified in countless ways, governing everything from streetcars and schools to sidewalks. This is the context in which the Rice Institute, too, had been founded for white inhabitants only. In one court filing, Leonard and Shaw also told the court that they were too poor to pay the required court fees. And we can tell from this document that Shaw was not able to write his own name. It's impossible to understand those facts or this lawsuit outside the context of hardening segregation in the 1890s and early 1900s in Houston. Meanwhile, on the other side of the case were the first trustees of the Rice Institute, seen here in 1911. They controlled millions of dollars in assets and had deep connections to the city's leadership and hundreds of pieces of real estate instead of just the one. And the Institute, of course, was represented in court by Baker and Botts, one of the most powerful law firms in the state. These advantages, too, cannot be understood outside the context of racial segregation. And yet, given that context, it's not surprising that Leonard, Hardy, and Shaw were willing to fight. Because as we've already seen today, Black Houstonians had worked hard to buy land and build institutions in this area. No wonder that in their petitions to the court, Leonard, Hardy, and Shaw took time to detail the history of this neighborhood and the work that had been done here to better their world. They talked about how they and their ancestors had used Smith Alley for more than 30 years. In other words, since Reconstruction. They even mentioned that Black children had once used the alley to get to their classes at the Gregory Institute. But now, claimed the plaintiffs, the Rice Institute had unlawfully fenced the southern end of Smith Alley, blocking residents from entry and exit to their own home. And the residents insisted on their right to said alley. Clearly, in addition to being a valuable asset, land meant something more to people who had survived enslavement. It represented heritage, autonomy, upward mobility, freedom, and their rights as citizens worthy of respect, even if their full enjoyment of that citizenship was so often denied in the Jim Crow South. And so in that sense, this lawsuit is a source not so different from the Red Book of Houston. Both documents were designed to communicate and defend the dignity and worth of all the work that Black Houstonians had done since emancipation to secure property, education, and hard-won rights. To the Rice Institute, by contrast, these lots were an increasingly small part of a much larger portfolio. And the early trustees were beginning to care less and less about what happened there. By 1908, the Institute had largely abandoned its original plans to build a campus in the Fourth Ward. Our first president, Edgar Odell Lovett, did inspect the Louisiana Street property while interviewing for the job. But after he saw it, he advised the trustees to acquire a much larger piece of land, which they did when they assembled the campus where we are sitting now. Still, the lawsuit about Smith Alley remained unresolved, even as the Rice Institute began construction on Main Street. In 1911, a lawyer for the Rice Institute reported to the trustees on the suit, quote, by Leonard, Hardy, and Shaw versus the Institute to prevent the Institute from closing off egress from their homes, end quote. The lawyers recommended that the board purchase the plaintiffs' lots to settle the suit, perhaps indicating that they were not certain of their legal position on the fence. But the only problem for the Institute was Leonard, Hardy, and Shaw still did not want to sell. This map from 1916 may even show that the neighbors were successful in forcing the Institute to give them a small access from the alley to Jefferson. But as long as the Black neighbors held on to their lots, they presented the Institute with the dilemma: what to do with the old grounds now that construction was booming on the new ones. Rice officials knew that they would not be able to sell the whole of this surrounding property for as good a price until they owned all of the contiguous lots in this tract. So in the meantime, Rice decided to sell off or lease smaller pieces of the land. Part of the Louisiana Street property, as you can see here, was sold to the Houston School Board for a new school building, the Taylor School, in 1914. Some of the property was leased without cost to the YMCA, which built some tennis courts right around here. And throughout these years, records in the university archives contain occasional hints that officials still knew who their neighbors were as well as how they viewed them. In 1912, for example, the city informed the Rice Institute that it needed to remove all the tin cans and trash littering its Louisiana Street property. The business manager told the property's caretaker to see to it, adding that, quote, "We think there are some Negroes in your neighborhood who do hauling of this kind." On another occasion, needing to take down an old shed on the property, the Institute asked a different correspondent to, quote, "have a cheap Negro pull it down." One reason for all the trash on the lot was the fact that for several years, beginning in 1910, the trustees decided to rent the Louisiana Street property to traveling circuses, including Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey. And more than a decade later, the property was still being used as a circus grounds when the Rice Institute allowed the local Ku Klux Klan to hold what they called a charity circus on the Louisiana Street property in 1923. Now, how that came to pass is a whole other story that would take me another lecture to tell. But for now, I'll just point out that when thousands of Klansmen descended on the Louisiana Street property in 1923 for their event, Betty Leonard was still living nearby, on the same property her mother, Sally Wicks, had bought just after emancipation. Despite pressure from the Rice Institute to leave, and in the face of all the dramatic changes around her, Betty Leonard had held on to the land bequeathed by her mother. And that's why when the Institute hired a surveyor in 1923 to map all of its property in this area, it was Leonard's home that was labeled on the map with the caption where we began. The Negro lot was hers. 2 years after this map was made, however, Betty Leonard died in 1925. She was buried near her mother, Sally Wicks, in Olivewood, an African-American cemetery near a bank of White Oak Bayou. And thanks to the dedicated work of a community organization that's trying to preserve that cemetery, Wicks' tombstone still stands, though Leonard's resting place is unmarked. But we do know that the month after she died in 1925, the Rice Institute's business manager, A.B. Cohn, appeared at a meeting of the trustees to inform them that Lot 5 was finally available to buy. After Betty Leonard's death, the Rice Institute purchased her lot for $3,000 from her son and only heir. Shaw had died and Hardy had left a few years before that, so the trustees had now completed their control of everything encircled by the red pencil on this map. In 1927, the Institute then reached an agreement to sell everything to the Houston Independent School District, which wanted to use the enlarged property for the first of two new junior colleges, one for whites and one for colored students. The final sale was completed in 1929 for $236,250, just a few months before the stock market crashed. In the end, HISD would choose other locations for both the white junior college, which later evolved into the University of Houston, and the Houston College for Negroes, which eventually became Texas Southern University. Nonetheless, this sale highlighted how dramatically the Louisiana Street property and its surroundings had been transformed over the previous 6 decades. From the backyard of the Gregory Institute to the site of a Ku Klux Klan event, to the real estate of a rigidly segregated school district. The transformation told in miniature the larger story of Jim Crow Houston, which by 1930 was divided in numerous ways by the color line. And that returns us to the question, when did Rice University's history with segregation begin? It would be easy, but too easy, I think, to answer that question by saying that segregation started in 1912 with the exclusion of black students from the first class to attend the Institute. This story of a small place in the Fourth Ward reminds us that the Rice Institute's history in Houston is even older than the history of this campus. Rice's relationship with black Houstonians like Betty Leonard began years before the first students entered the Sallyport and decades before the first black students and faculty did. This story also reminds us that from the beginning, Rice University has always been more than only an academic institution. It's also been a legal corporation, a manager of immense wealth, a real estate owner and developer, an employer, a litigant, a mover and shaker in city politics, and much else, all at the very same time. In 1912, the very same year that Rice held elaborate ceremonies to mark its opening, it was simultaneously battling Leonard, Hardy, and Shaw in court and renting downtown property to circuses and the YMCA. Clearly then, if we want to understand the whole history of Rice with respect to segregation, we'll have to start even before 1912. After all, the main injustice alleged by Leonard, Hardy, and Shaw against Rice was not their exclusion from classes at a university that did not yet even exist. Rather, they objected that the Rice Institute was trying to eject them from a place that had long been theirs. Even so, the history of the Fourth Ward examined here and in the Red Book of Houston also points to another important truth. After slavery, Black Houstonians persevered, brick by brick, in the face of mounting challenges to their freedom. Long before Edgar Odell Lovett or the Rice Institute arrived, they built institutions like the Gregory Institute and individuals like Betty Leonard who could not be easily moved. And in the years to come, numerous people born, raised, and rooted within Black communities like theirs would play key roles in moving Rice University and the world in a better direction. But that's a later, longer story that will have to wait for another day. Thank you.